All right, I think the stream has started. Prime Minister, the floor is yours. PM?
Yep, just checking. This is loud and clear.
Yep.
All right. You guys in the chat, I'll take one from closing opposition, preferably at 5 minutes and 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Don't unmute before that. If I don't take you by 5:30, then you can definitely unmute. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Framing. What does concentration of resources look like? We think concentration of resources, or in, say, for example, particular cities within a single city, largely looks like you don't have effective transport and communication networks that are essentially developed in these places. Much looks like Russia, in which you have transport and communication networks only concentrated in St. Petersburg, or say, for example, Moscow. This also looks like there's not development of enough industries in cities that are outside this main central region. That is to say, you don't, say, for example, have development of industries largely, say, outside cities or Mexico City in Mexico in the first place to begin with. Second, what does discouragement or active discouragement look like? We think active discouragement goes ahead and looks like that we're going to increase taxes in these particular cities and these central cities to begin with. They're making them harder for individuals to move into these cities, or say, for example, purchase property, etc. This also means simultaneously we're going to encourage people moving into, say, for example, other provinces and other states within the same country. This largely looks like Texas reducing the state tax compared to the state tax being incredibly higher in, say, for example, states like California, or say, for example, government providing subsidized housing to essentially other provinces, or like incentivizing industries to go ahead and set up their manufacturing hubs in other provinces. We think at this point of time, we actively encourage for states to go ahead and prioritize other provinces that have not been the historical central pieces, say, for example, Mumbai or Delhi in India, or say, for example, Manila in the Philippines, etc. All right. What two pieces of characterization in terms of who are these individuals that are likely to stay in these single concentrated single cities in which development seems to be concentrated in. Firstly, we don't think lower income individuals in the vast majority of instances have access to these spaces in the first place. That's to say, it's much more likely that the rent of these spaces is already higher, say, for example, in cities like Mumbai, or cities, say, for example, in Manila in the Philippines, where rents are skyrocketed. At that point of time, you're much less likely to have people from lower income neighborhoods. It's much more likely that rich individuals mostly concentrate these spaces. But more secondly, we think it's most likely that people from majoritarian ethnic dominant groups are ones that are living in these cities. This largely looks like Roman Catholics that live in, say, for example, Manila, or this largely looks like the majoritarian Hindu population overarching that lives in centers like New Delhi. We think at that, because of historical alignments, and in terms of how states have essentially been distinguished at that point of time, much less likely that people from minority communities are in these cities or in these spaces. Much more likely that intrinsically, mostly in the global south, mostly in developing countries where you need this development to happen in the first place, in those spaces, it's much more dominated by the majoritarian communities. All right. Firstly, two impacts. All the arguments are going to concentrate on two impacts. One, why this is harmful for the state, and secondly, why this is harmful for the individuals living within the state. Firstly, in terms of economics, why this is harmful for the state. The problem is, point at which you concentrate resources into one particular city or one particular province, it's very difficult for you to essentially diversify, simply because economic models are largely uneven to begin with. That is to say, you lose out on niche specific interests that other states and provinces can be good at, point at which you don't essentially diversify. This largely looks like the Silicon Valley perhaps that operates in California, but say, for example, the oil and petroleum industries that operate in Texas. This largely looks like the, say, for example, India Silicon Valley that operates in Bangalore, but say India's mining industries that largely are concentrated towards the central part of India, which means you can't develop niche industrial spaces or niche specific industries in these provinces, point at which you concentrated only one particular city, because it's more likely that resources are one that are distributed, but also means small and cottage scale industry. Say, for example, the Kashmir handloom industry is something that's only concentrated in the state of Kashmir, is one thing that you're less likely to get, point at which you concentrate development in these spaces. That's why on this, you can't predict economic models, because the heterogeneity of the country is something that's difficult to predict, and that's why it's difficult for you to get that economic growth. But secondly, it's likely that your investments are likely to be inferior from corporations, simply because the saturation level that you're going to hit in these cities in the first place, because most of these geographical spaces are concentrated. Like Mumbai, surrounded by water on all three sides, you literally can't expand unless and until encroach upon the sea, which means land spaces are largely concentrated or what you are clogged in these spaces that prevents, say, for example, horizontal expansion or like expansion in these spaces, which means at this point of time, it reaches a saturation limit in terms of the industries that you can set up, or say, for example, the amount of spaces that you can essentially access. But also the number of population that grows in these cities means that the lives of individuals are much more likely to be substandard. They're likely to be crammed into, clogged into spaces, say, for example, as you have in places like Hong Kong, etc. But also means that pollution levels in these cities are way more likely to increase. That makes perhaps the air inbreathable for individuals in these cities. Look at Delhi, for example, or look at Beijing, for example, which means the life of individuals at an individual level, we think it's very difficult for individuals to essentially live in these spaces in substandard conditions when, say, for example, their lives are literally at risk. But secondly, it's less likely to get investment in these particular states from foreign corporations, or say, for example, foreign direct investment that comes in, because private companies at this point of time are disincentivized to invest, point at which you hit that saturation level. And because you don't have a diverse portfolio in terms of investments that you can attract from abroad, say, for example, or mining companies that can come to India and work in the central region, or IT companies that can work in Bangalore, that's impossible to get, point at which you don't go ahead and diversify these resources, which means at a state level, you're much more likely to have a resource crunch and lose out on these financial investments. And that's why it's bad for the state. We told you why it's bad for the individuals. Secondly, at a political level, we think you create centers of disposability within these countries, point at which you deprioritize certain provinces. This largely looks like you don't give them access to political capital. You reduce the number of seats that they're going to have in these places in the parliament, or reduce the amount of political say that they have. All right, before I move on, closing opposition. All right, 3, 2, 1. All right, I'll not take from opening up. All right, why is this politically harmful, and point at which why when you take away political capital from these individuals, why this is detrimental? Firstly, I think at an economic level, say, for example, niche or small cottage industry, say, for example, the Kashmir handloom industry, which is largely dying because, say, for example, the Indian state doesn't care to that extent in that part of the country. Or say, for example, the Xinjiang province in China, where Uyghur Muslims are largely discriminated. We think point at which you create disposable centers that the state can dispose of, because it doesn't have economic incentives to cater for these regions in the first place, neither the political incentives that these individuals require representation. What happens then? You make these people disillusioned and alienated with the concept of the state in general. That leads to more amount of conflicts, because now these individuals feel that their part of the country is not something that's developed. It's mostly like the majoritarian group hoarding resources in the central portion that is not allowing the trickle down into these provinces. You create disillusionment with the state. That is when you have like conflicts, and there's a propensity of conflicts and disillusionment that stems from alienation, point at which you go ahead and implement this policy. This largely looks like the genesis of conflicts that's largely happened. Say, for example, the Chinese state going ahead and prosecuting Uyghur Muslims, or looks like, say, for example, how the Muslims in the Mindanao region of Philippines are much more likely to be left over. Also, this looks like, say, for example, land acquisition. The state can go ahead and take away your land. What happened in the Philippines in the Mindanao region to begin with? Say, for example, trampling over their cultural sites, what's happening in the Xinjiang province in China. At that point of time, you create more amount of alienation and disillusionment with the state, creating a propensity for more amounts of conflicts to happen. That's why it's individual. It's detrimental for individuals. That's why it's detrimental from the state as a whole, point at which you make it more unstable and volatile. For those reasons, insanely proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the fine speech. Can we welcome Leader of Opposition? Here. Yeah.
To check me. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, that's really good. Just give me a second. The point at which the side of proposition loses this debate is when they never engage in actual incentives that the state undertakes to actually pursue their either economic or political goals. Because when they talk to you about, I don't know, development of economy in Kashmir, we tell you, well, why the fuck would Modi ever want to send capital there? He obviously doesn't like them. And actually, if you want to tackle the problems of inequalities or discrimination in the status quo, what you actually need to have is cultural assimilation in the cities. You need to have cultures integrating, not separating from each other because they're developing their local communities, cities, or whatever. We tell you that, in fact, the only way to get to the communities to communicate and integrate with each other and actually decrease the inequalities is if you have the development of huge cultural and capital hubs, which can only happen if you oppose this motion. So which countries are we talking about? Because we see that actually the model of the opposition, where you actually concentrate a huge part of your both economic and political agenda, is what's happening throughout the most of the Europe, like London, Paris, Croatia, Serbia, Balkan countries. You also see it in some parts of Asia, etc. We tell that you have biggest budget in one city, you have most economic projects there, and yes, they have a huge amount of political power. But we tell you that this is so for two reasons. Firstly, we tell you that in these cities itself, a huge number of population lives there, and we tell you that they actually deserve a lot of economic investment, especially because living in these cities is most likely most expensive. So actually they need this. Secondly, we told that these cities are the biggest sources of economic development, so they deserve this, especially because they're going to contribute it indirectly to the rest of the state. Now, moving on to the rebuttal. When the side of opposition tells you, okay, well, we are going to be actually encouraging development of smaller cities, blah, 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 what we tell you, okay, great. How can you actually ensure that if you have the decentralization policy, the money is going to go to the communities which actually need the money the most? Because we tell you that actually the poorest communities or the most disenfranchised ones have the least political power, because actually political elites are the ones who are ruling the country, who are ruling the system, especially in developing economies. So we tell you that they would have no incentive to do that. Secondly, when we talk about hard diversification of economics, we tell you that actually we need less and less workforce abroad to make to work in agriculture or in industry, etc. We tell you that most of it is done by machines. However, what you need to have is actually, lawyers' offices, hospitals, financial centers who need to be concentrated in one place. So you don't need that much workforce abroad to be able to diversify economy. Yes, we maybe need to push some resources there, but that can still be made from one city and one political agenda, because actually the products of these labors, either in agriculture or in industry abroad, are going to be accumulated in the city and processed in the city. Finally, when we talk about pollution, we tell you, well, not really. We had communism in Europe. You had smaller cities in Europe. Go to the Czech Republic, go up to the north of the country and see how small cities are living. We tell you that pollution is even worse in smaller cities because you cannot pursue a really big and costly green agenda, which is needed to actually tackle the pollution in the status quo. Now, moving on to the constructive. We tell you that firstly, you have a cost efficiency, which happens when you centralize resources and political power. Why? Because simply you don't need to build 100 roads or 100 hospitals. You need to build one good metro and 5 good hospitals. So we tell you that instead of building 100 mediocre hospitals, yes, you're going to build 5, and they're actually going to have good enough machines to provide good and quality health services to the citizens. We tell you that this in the weighing is much better than being able to cure a fever, as opposed to actually being able to cure a cancer to most of the people. Bear in mind that most of the people in the status quo are actually either living in big cities anymore right now or moving to them. So actually this impact is very important for them, even in terms of calculating the benefits. Secondly, what we tell you is that actually what happens is that it is also better to pursue an economic agenda in big cities. Why? Because firstly, when a company goes into a city, they see a city in a developing country, they see that it may have 10 million citizens, and it says, okay, maybe it's a slum city, maybe the living spaces are small. However, there are 10 million people living there. This means that you have a huge workforce that can live there. You have a huge population that can consume the resources without the cost of actually shipping these products abroad. So we tell you that actually you have the biggest incentive to go into a big city and invest there, because you're going to have the biggest amount of workforce and the biggest market to push your products there, especially because you're actually going to have more companies working in the same city. So it's going to be easier to push even the more complicated levels of doing business in there. Furthermore, we tell you that we have better political decisions being done in centralized states, and that is so for many reasons. Firstly, we tell you that we have less local level politics, because even if we concede to the proposition's premise that there's going to be some sort of better representation on the side of proposition, we tell you that it's actually really bad that you have local politics happening in the way that we're actually ignoring a big political agenda. We tell you that actually what needs to be done, for example, when we talk about land expropriation, we tell you that the only way to actually push for a land reform in, South America, which has a huge problem with land inequalities, which is actually the biggest source of poverty in those countries right now. The only way to do it is through a state level agenda being pushed from one city, instead of having local politics which only cater to their own citizens, saying, okay, no, you stay with your land, we're not going to push for anything bold because we want to be elected. Furthermore, we tell you that actually bureaucracy costs a lot of money, and this is the money that most of the developing or emerging economies simply don't have it, and should be instead pushed into providing for better resources or jobs opening. And furthermore, we tell you that the more local politics you have, the corruption is more likely to happen, simply because of the devolution. CG, do you have a point maybe? Okay, moving on. So what we want you to remember is that on the comparative in this debate, you cannot build 100 cities or 100 economic capitals on the side of proposition, because most of the countries, A, don't have the capital to do so, B, don't have the incentive to do so, because they still want to cater to their political elites who are funding their, I don't know, election campaigns, etc. So what happens is that you can either choose to build one big city, to build, I don't know, one Mumbai or one Mexico City, which in fact does employ a lot of people and is still the biggest source of economic development and profits for the Mexico state. Or you can try playing with regional politics, which are most likely not going to play out well, because firstly, you have no incentive for companies to go there and invest there, and secondly, because you're going to have local level politics which are biased, which are not meritocratic, and which are extremely corrupted. For all of these reasons, we beg you, please oppose the motion. I will take the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for the fine speech. Can we welcome DPM? Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, I'll just start. No, hold this. Yeah, okay. 3, 2, 1. Panel Anurag Kashyap, who's a director in India, was asked by this American journalist, why don't you make movies on superheroes or movies on something good? Why do you make movies on toilets and stuff like that? The reason, he said, is because outside of Mumbai, most of India still does not have access to toilets and stuff. And that's the biggest problem I have with concentrated development. And I'm going to explain this properly. I have two pieces of material contribution that I want to make in this debate. But before that, I have like a couple of extraneous responses that don't really fit into my speech anywhere. Number one, on the cost of it. Look, often what O was saying is not true, right? Because development now needs to connect and concentrate to that one central region where the problem, and that is where the problem is. Because number one, it's more expensive. Because number one, land is more expensive because that's the only region where most companies and IT firms and development infrastructure happens, which means often demand and supply means that thing is obviously more expensive. Secondly, resources, things like transport networks, which are not strategically located, and therefore transport is often harder, which means that you're now transporting large amount of raw material and resources from vast, like different regions of your country, like for example, in India or US, to that one central region, which means that the transport cost and the infrastructural transport that develops around it is often then A, more expensive, but B, is often worse off, because now you're only creating connections and road networks to that one region. This is the reason why throughout the 80s and the 90s, Moscow and Russia was concentrated around that region, and therefore there was this popular saying that all roads end up in Moscow, right? That's the problem here. Thirdly, it does not create or sustain local economies. Therefore, the price or the central system, the price of the central area is often indicatively higher, which means the cost of storage and other things are often higher, which means it's bad for industries, things are more expensive, blah, blah, blah. Number two, on political incentives. Look, there are political incentives to develop these regions because A, there are resources there, which means that there are obviously direct incentives for development, but I'll tell you why that does not happen and why that's therefore bad. Number one, on the posterior development of tertiary regions and why that is often fractured. Number one is that communities compete for developmental incentives in most countries, like in most diverse countries, like where there are different ethnic and linguistic and geographical groups, communities compete with each other for development. This means that states compete and create worse systems of incentives, like or investment incentives, like things like Texas creating tax breaks, or the state of Kolkata in West Bengal sidelining environmental, and by the way, Kolkata is in the Sundarbans, so they're sidelining environmental regulations to attract investment. All of this means that when the central government or a central agency does not prioritize uniform investment and does not deprioritize central investments, states have to step in order for them to create some sort of development and create jobs for their people, which means that they often compete with each other, which means that to the end of it, they often end up with worse off like agreeable things like worse off regulations, worse off stuff like that. So which means that all over it's often worse, because this means that environmental regulations and other kinds of regulations are often sidelined because of this competition. Number two, it also means communities are now incentivized to compete with each other in a lot of countries with ethnic or geographical diversity, because of their ability to progress is literally linked to, like, you know, their ability to outcompete other groups. The impact here is number one, that is often they agree to detrimental policies that I've said, and they have to create these uniform, sustainable policies, which is often bad for them, which means that, hey, I'm gonna allow you to, destroy the forest or whatever. Like what happened in Brazil, like in Bolsonaro's Brazil, like people in those, like those forested regions are not central parts of the economic system of Brazil, which means that the central government often is okay destroying them. But number two, look, regions are then unable to create centralized or specialized markets because they're always competing with a central hub where investment is concentrated, which means that even if you have local investments or local, what is the word for it? Local expertise, right? Even if that is there, I don't think investment happens. For example, like the handloom industries in India, in the south of India, were really good, right? They're really good handloom industries. And there's a large amount of coal industries in the east. All of this does not happen in the absence of like divested investments, because you don't allow these communities and these markets to develop in a logical, in a realistic manner. The problem with creating central things is now you're just using their raw goods and transporting them to this one central hub where all the manufacturing, everything is happening, which means that the end result of progress does not really reach those regions. Thirdly, Rito talked about it, like local markets and niche markets in those developing countries often don't get anything. Like Kashmir, Bhutan, like the handloom industries have often been destroyed because of the large-scale concentration of like fabrics in North India. Number two, the second thing I want to talk about is that the second impact here is the quality of life often suffers in the periphery. And this may look like, number one, infrastructure investment in most developed economies are insufficient to maintain like the quality of infrastructure. Obviously, because if you just want to build a road where your raw materials reach, like for example, one major city like New York, you probably won't care about like cities in the outlier cities where they require electricity, housing, food. You don't care about those cities because these people are disposable to you. Number two, transportation infrastructure is shit then, because your transportation is only linked to one part. Things like electricity, water, sewage, communication, everything suffers. This is important because you create cycles of dependence on major regions and thereby reduce and often remove the ability of these smaller regions to have political voices. This will become important in 30 seconds. Future policies and around these people then become like concentrated around the need of this one central figure, and that is the problem. Before I talk about how that like engages with local communities and minorities, I'll take a POI from CEO or O, anyone.
Why is it that people choose to want to live in those big cities, and how is that going to change?
Right. Yeah. Look, the reason why people choose to live in those big cities is because number one, there's already an existing level of investments, which means that people know that, hey, look, my region, like I'll give you my example, right? I moved to Mumbai like 5 years ago because I know Kolkata does not have investment in terms of the fields I want to go into. Like, for example, it does not have IT investments. It does not have infrastructural investment. Housing is shit in Kolkata, which means that in order for me to have a good life, I need to move to these regions, which means that in the absence of, let's say, for example, the government coming and creating investment in Kolkata, my life is shit. But number two, society and people in power often have inherent incentives to regulate and limit communities in those regions. Economic barriers and developmental barriers are tools that administrations often use in developing countries to subjugate minorities. Like the Adivasi tribals in northeast of India, which are non-Hindu communities, are discarded and very little investment is provided to them. The only investment is like resource extraction. There's no actual electrical, financial or market investment that happen. The reason this can happen is because centers where concentrated developments are happening are often majority influence, right? Because these are the communities which have concentrated power. These are big city people, quote unquote, who have power. Economic contribution therefore is gate kept, and therefore you're unlikely to have these regions come up and develop or have their voices heard because they're not a part of the system in the first place. This is where the disposability argument that Rito makes comes into crutch, right? Because look at Uyghur or China or Brazil or any other country in the world. Often centralized economies are the reason why these communities can be sidelined, because these communities and these regions don't provide incentives for the government to give a shit about them, or incentives for these central and big cities to say, hey, we need to create investment and infrastructural development in those regions. This is why the money won't go to communities that deserve them when finances are centralized in response to opening opposition. I hope I've been clear. Very, very proud to propose. Thank you so much.
Thank you, DPM, for the fine speech. Can we welcome the DLO? Here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to ask for a POI, and at that point, I would like someone to preferably closing to just open up their mics and shoot the POI, but no interruptions before that point. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Ladies and gentlemen, let's understand exactly how the world looks like. Because what today opening government has completely failed to do is given us a comparative of how the two worlds look like. They've come up with this idealistic case when, you know, every single city is going to become great and there's going to be economy flourishing in every single city. But that's simply not true, right? We tell you that at a point at which you say that a state like Maharashtra has very little toilets, in their own example, has so low infrastructure that there's literally no toilets available in other cities. We tell you that it doesn't matter if they deprioritize Bombay. The only thing that will do is it will decrease economic capital of Bombay and it will not attract investment in all these cities. We tell you that infrastructure takes years to build, if not decades, and it requires significant capital and investment. And that itself is a huge reason why you should not propose this motion. We tell you that in the ideal world, if we had unlimited resources, we would just as much as proposition like to create a world wherein every city is just as developed. We tell you that that's far from reality. We tell you that there cannot be 50 New Yorks. There can be only and only one New York. And at the point in which you try to deprioritize New York and in place to like prioritize other cities, we tell you that the only thing that you do is draw away from the economic, political, and cultural capital that a state itself gains from these cities. And we tell you that's really detrimental. But let's look at, give a short-term versus long-term analysis of this motion, right? Like, let's look at what this would look like in the short term. We tell you that these people talk about how they really care about the poor in cities and how, you know, the land prices are going up and this really sucks for the poor. But at the point in which they propose literal taxation and like detrimental policies towards housing, we tell you that the people who are going to be worst affected by this are the poor itself. And in their model itself, in no world is there going to be an instant creation of these large meta capitals so that the poor can instantly migrate to some other cities. It's very, very obvious that capital and infrastructure takes time to build. So at the point at which you create higher taxation, higher capital, higher land taxes, higher land revenue, everything higher in these cities, we tell you that the poor now, so imagine you're like an immigrant worker who's suddenly moved to like New York and now you want to make your money and everything and you spend your life savings. Suddenly you have like these higher capital taxes and now you that people are being told that like this city, go to some other city, but there's no jobs yet because there's no infrastructure yet and there's no infrastructure structures available yet. So in the short term, this is completely sucky, right? Like as a poor person living in the city, this completely sucks. I have spent my life's fortune to make it here and now there's no way for me to go. But okay, and we tell you that this short-term problem is large enough to like mitigate any of the impacts that they've created in the long term. We tell you that even in the long term, this is not how the world would look like because of simple economics, right? Like we tell you that at the point in which the only way you can create greater development is by having greater resources. We tell you that we do so a lot more on our side, and this is something I'm going to address in my arguments. But first, on their ideas, it's the one significant mistake that they made throughout the speech is they've confused cities with states. Like, yeah, I mean, like, yeah, we should prioritize Kashmir, but that has nothing to do with like, for example, they kept giving these examples. Like, for example, they said that, hey, listen, you know, we need diversity. So all of the arguments they mentioned are more to do with states than they are to do with cities. And I'll explain to you why. They talk about how the different areas have niche interests, right? And they give this example about, hey, listen, you know, we have the skill industry in like the skilled IT industry in Bangalore, and we need to prioritize that. We tell you that Bangalore is a large city. And at the point which they're actually like rebutting their own arguments when they say that we need to prioritize Bangalore because Bangalore is the largest city in Karnataka. And this is what we're talking about, right? Like the only world in which we can have a city like Bangalore being competitive with the other IT giants like in Silicon Valley is if a state like Karnataka prioritizes Bangalore. We cannot have 50 cities being prioritized because they would never be competitive on a global scale. And it's something that's never addressed in the first place, right? Like you need to have this. And in terms of diverse niche interests, we tell you that such great diversity doesn't exist within state boundaries. We tell you that state is significantly smaller geographically and has lesser diversity in terms of like infrastructure to create goods. But we tell you that, okay, even if, for example, a small city was to create, for example, has Kashmiri handlooms, we tell you that inherently the city would start flourishing on its own. And at that point in time, the state should prioritize that city itself, because we tell you that states only prioritize cities that have these capitals in the first place. We tell you that the reason why Bangalore was capitalized was because it was a hub for IT investments. And this is exactly what we're creating in this world. We're prioritizing the cities that have the ability to do well, and we're making them competitive on a global scale. Yes, sir. I would take a POI from closing up at this point.
The building of infrastructure creates huge numbers of jobs, and thus people will move to these areas following this investment. Does this not solve the issues of overpopulation and increasing rent prices you talk of?
Okay, sure. So you talk about this building infrastructure. Firstly, like at the point in which you're struggling with a state who can't afford creation of like toilets across the state, we tell you that they don't have enough capital to create infrastructure every single place. You need to create this capital in the first place. You need to first tell me how a state like Maharashtra, which has been doing such a terrible job of like even creating infrastructure for like toilets, is now suddenly going to have enough infrastructure to create in the first place, and then follow on into any other steps, right? Like this is something that you need to do as government. Secondly, this idea of disposability, right? Like this idea about how, and this is a core point that brought about in terms of political ideas also, like, that these smaller cities are going to be disposable entities. We argue that you need to recognize that city boundaries are not as stringent as something like state boundaries. So, for example, my identity living in West Bengal. So, for example, I come from Siliguri, right? But I don't characterize myself as someone living in Siliguri and not a person who lives in the city of Calcutta, which is the central city of the state of West Bengal. This is to say that I can very easily go to Calcutta, and I often do. I often make a trip to Calcutta on a daily basis. This is true for a lot of workers. A lot of workers live in smaller villages outside, and then they make their way out, which is like usually an hour's journey into larger cities. Given that, we tell you that their interest, their identity is not represented by the city itself. It's represented by the state on a large. So this entire idea of like a cycle of dependence is completely okay, because of the fact that there's no one single identity. We tell you that we on our side of the house create much larger benefits, and that is why we take this house. So like onto our like constructive, we tell you that what we uniquely do is create these economies globally competitive. My first speaker has already touched on this, and I'm gonna, like, the only thing about how like you create global competitiveness, but we also talked to you about like the only way you can actually be competitive in the global market is because you need to have economies of scale, and economies of scale can only exist in single economies. And because we give this, because we ensure that there's greater capital investment from companies, because we ensure that there is better representation, because there's more diverse representation, and we tell you that we mitigate both short-term and long-term harms, we tell you that we win this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, DRO, for the fine speech. Can we welcome Member of Government? Here.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
What opposition need to understand is that the world is changing. It is no longer the place it was. It is no longer centered around agricultural and basic manufacturing industries. And it is no longer the case that countries are just starting to industrialize. We tell you, in this new world of technology, in this new world of change, we are uniquely able to spread out economic and political power without creating the problems that urbanization causes. I'm going to talk to you today about how the dominance of cities leads to things like increased populism and increased anti-immigration sentiment, and why those things are so bad. But first, some points of rebuttal. The first main thing to note is that they repeatedly say that most people live in big cities. No, this is just not true. Think of the biggest cities in the world: London, New York, Mumbai. None of these cities still have like over 50% of the population, right? London does not have over 50% of the UK population, but it still has so much more political power than anywhere else. Same is true of countries throughout the world. It may be true that individual rural areas have a small amount of power because they individually have small populations, but when you add up the total power of rural populations, it is so huge, and they utilize it in many different ways currently. The second thing they tell us is that lots of people live in these cities, and therefore they need this investment. We tell you that when we invest in the way OG talk about in rural areas, people will subsequently move to these areas in order to take up the jobs as a result of the investment, as a result of the infrastructure. The only real response they give to this is that the government don't have the funds to invest. But the government can encourage investment from international firms by doing things like enabling contracts. and B, we've told you about how we have a taxation system from opening government. At no point do they tell you why taxing the very wealthy in these cities won't work. They just repeatedly tell us that it won't. And thirdly, like this is a This House Believes motion. We are allowed to say that this is a policy we would do if we had the capital to do it, even if there are mechanical issues. What we have to talk about is the consequences, not the mechanisms in a motion like this. Then they give us a quick point about how like regional politics are biased, meritocratic, and corrupt, and therefore like investment will be bad. We give you 3 reasons why it's more likely that city politics will be like this than politics in rural areas. Firstly, city politicians are more likely to be power thirsty, which is why they're looking to have control in huge areas. Secondly, city politicians are more likely to face large amounts of political pressure because of the huge number of investments they face, as opposed to rural politicians who are only offered a few different investments. And third, city politicians are less likely to be involved with normal people on the ground. This means you're more likely to choose investments and business partnerships which benefit everyone because you are part of the community, as opposed to just those which benefit the very wealthy, which you are likely to do when you are part of the elite within a city. Now I'm going to do the rest of my rebuttal in my closing, but now onto my point, which is why this leads to increased anti-immigration sentiment and populism, and why that is so bad. Before I do that, I'll take a POI from opening government.
You need to tell me why in a state like Maharashtra, wherein like government characterizes little to no toilets, are international companies ever going to come and invest in the short term?
Okay, so we don't want investment in these cities. What we want is investment in rural areas. There are a few reasons they'd be willing to invest in rural areas if we give them the mechanisms to do so. One, it is incredibly hard now for them to like create contracts with governments, because governments are always pushing for you to have these investments in cities because the powerful politicians are in the cities. If we change that, if we empower rural politicians, and if we allow the contracts which want to be in rural areas to get through, that in and of itself will be enough. But we also told you a second mechanism, the tax system, which you still haven't engaged with. Back onto my point. So OG tell us how like cities can actually be full of like the very wealthy elite. And we tell you that's true of certain areas, but many of these cities are actually very diverse. And they also contain like huge areas which, like they say, are very overpopulated, are often very poor, and have huge number of immigrants, firstly from the countryside, and secondly from abroad. However, overall, despite this, these cities are still more wealthy than like rural areas. They get greater investment overall than these rural areas. Government told you how this leads to disillusionment from individuals within the city. And this is true. However, it also leads to disillusionment of individuals in the countryside, of those who are comparatively more powerful than immigrants within the city. Why are these individuals in rural areas actually quite powerful? Firstly, they're more likely to do things like vote. They're more likely to have been there for a long time, have families there for a long time, feel a large amount of national pride, of patriotic culture, etc. Secondly, they're more likely to be politically engaged, to know their local politicians, to belong to powerful groups such as the ethnic minority. And third, across the country in total, there is a large number of people living in rural areas. Why do these individuals become disillusioned? Firstly, they see all the investment going to these cities because this is where government is pushing contracts, because this is where people are migrating to. Secondly, they see all the development occurring there. Third, they feel like the state doesn't care about them because they're not getting the investment they need. And fourth, these areas are often filled with older individuals who are more prone to things like media, which says things like you're not being cared about, they only care about the cities, they only care about these immigrants. Why is the disillusionment of these people so bad? Because whilst it's not true, the media is filled with ideas that the immigrants are the ones taking up all the money and space and investment. Thus, those in rural areas, which are huge numbers of people, often millions and millions, blame these immigrants for their state's lack of care about them. This leads to many bad outcomes. Firstly, voting for politicians which will actively harm them just because they are anti-immigrant. For example, people voted for Brexit to get out the immigrants, and now we essentially can't get groceries that are essential in our shops. Secondly, these immigrants often deal with harms from an increase in things like hate crime to policies which make it harder for them to do things like attain refugee status or get their children's spaces into schools. Know that these individuals still don't have investment because when they're actively voting for politicians who are anti-immigrant, these are the same politicians who are not running on platforms such as like increase investment in rural areas, because they are utilizing this populism, utilizing this idea so they don't have to invest in rural areas, because they are doing things like kicking out the new guys who are taking up our land. When you get this investment into rural areas, encourage this immigration throughout a country, mix different groups, encourage empathy and passion, that's when we can focus on real issues, get the investment in these areas we need, help everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Member of Government, for the fine speech. Can we welcome MO? Here.
Hey, can you hear me well?
Yep.
Thank you. 3, 2, 1. The last part of our case is directly on clash with closing government. So for the moment, just one piece of response to their characterization of the debate. I know it's annoying because I'm really old in debating, but this House believes that X should motions are about the actions and the mechanisms undertaken by X to do something. They're not about the outcome. If CA team wanted us to debate the outcome, they would have set an outcome motion, as in this House believes it would be good if there were less concentrated power, etc. That's not the motion they said. They set a motion about actions undertaken to achieve that. Therefore, the likely mechanisms that will be used by governments in order to achieve those, which honestly I think opening government is characterized pretty well and pretty fairly, are what we are debating, in addition to any outcomes that those may generate. What I'm going to do then in my extension is two things. One, prove why concentration of power is to a degree inevitable and also ultimately for the best. Secondly, prove why the actions taken in order to discourage it are both wrong in terms of utilizing the individual as a means rather than an end, but secondly, also just destructive in a variety of ways for the country that we're talking about. Why is this inevitable? I think the context that is crucial to understand here is a context of globalization. Specifically there, the priority of being able to, not just produce your product, but get them on a supply chain. Get them on a supply chain that is efficient, because if you don't, someone else that produces a product that to the consumer is similar and therefore serves the same demand will get it to them faster, or will get it to them cheaper. That is the reason why, despite the fact that land in capital cities is massively more expensive, it is still profitable to produce there, because the reason that they're capital cities is because they are close to things like harbors or major trade routes that allow you to actually do that, and therefore make your industry profitable in terms of competing abroad. The reason that you have to do this and can't just cater locally is otherwise other companies within your country will trade internationally, will make more profit out of this, and therefore will be able to lower their prices with their foreign profits, drive you out of business domestically, and you're fucked. Therefore, you have to engage in international competition and ensure that you have the access to supply chains and network effects like international lawyers, etc. In order to do that, that is why the city remains incredibly attractive. That is why in most cases, I think, opening government's policies are simply ineffective, because those effects continue to exist. All the other effects, by the way, which they gave in response to Mary's points of information on why people move to the city, also continue to exist unless they prove that they successfully generate meaningful economic development and companies moving to other cities and other areas in the country. They haven't done that, and specifically the reason that they can't do that is the material that I've presented just now, meaning in most of those situations, this is simply a waste of resources. Note that it doesn't matter whether you build infrastructure there in general. It matters whether companies are willing to move there at the point where you do, because ultimately they are the ones that drive jobs. They are the ones that make people willing to move places. At that point, this is a waste of resources that could go into direct harm reduction, either in terms of dealing with the immense pollution in the city, which I think is probably an issue in a lot of these places, which there is political capital for insofar as the city is politically powerful, and the harm of things like pollution or bad infrastructure or overloaded infrastructure are experienced both by many people insofar as they're often quite widespread. Things like pollution can't really be like limited to one specific area within a city. But secondly, they're experienced by people who hold meaningful amounts of power in a city, because at the point where your employees can't work as well because they're all sick from pollution, it's something you want fixed, and that's something you want your local politician to direct resources toward addressing. But secondly, I think there's also an incentive to use some of the funding that opening government are wasting on subsidizing people to do things that they will never do because it is not profitable for them to do so, even if they get a one-time subsidy. To do things like addressing harm in the countryside. Because I think if opening government can figure it out, that there's conflict risk if you have a countryside that's massively impoverished, I'm pretty sure that the governments of these countries can figure that out too. Most governments don't want conflict happening around their border. Yes, there is a degree of competition over resources, but I think you can sell quite effectively to the city a sympathetic image of wanting to make sure that the country is stable. You can also sell the fates that you're addressing with this, of like, you know, the grandma who can't move to the city, because you sold quite sympathetically. You can generate a willingness by people to invest in that to a degree. Secondly, though, like opening government to this says, oh, there's ethnic differences. One, that's not always the case. But secondly, I don't know why ethnic differences mean that you can't have empathy for other people, meaning that that incentive probably still exists. And if anything, I think we address the situation of potential conflict between rural and city better. Even if it was effective, I think it would still be better to just invest directly in infrastructure or like the industry development that is particularly profitable in your country, regardless of where it is. OG say there are particular regionally specific industries. That's probably true, but there's also probably industries that aren't yet developed in the city because they haven't gotten enough investment. And I have no idea why I should prefer the ones in the country. I have an idea why I should prefer the ones in the city. They are likelier to succeed at the point where you give them starting capital because they are in a place where they don't face barriers to getting their products to people or getting their services to people, meaning that it is a more certain investment. Therefore, you should be doing it. If opening government says we will only do this in the city and we won't invest anywhere else, I've given you a reason why that's fine. I also think, though, that to the degree that I am not given by them a reason why, at the point where we're no longer, where we are engaging in the government policy of limiting migration to the city, why the city suddenly becomes super pro-funding people that are elsewhere, and why they suddenly really want to be nice to people in rural areas, which is sort of the underlying assumption of them getting anything of that after discouraging that migration. So I'm not sure why they would get it. OG.
Yeah, so on supply chains, the ability of regions in the periphery to join supply chains is linked to investment incentives, which then create sustainability, creating value like for media and political people to come in and engage. Yeah.
I can cut off a POI, stop. The thing is that getting that supply chain going might be a useful thing to do if there is promising industry there. If not, getting the supply chain there won't do anything. It is not always the case that there is massive potential for an industry to develop. At that point, it is an inefficient investment that doesn't adequately do harm reduction. Secondly, why are the actions taken to discourage this wrong and bad? A, they are taxes. They are attaching a cost to something that people ultimately want to do. I think this is wrong for two reasons. A, the government has specifically fucked over people in rural areas. It has presumably hurt them and put them in a position where they want to move. That now it is taking away their autonomy to actually do so. I think that's probably wrong insofar as those people have a right to improve their circumstances. Government doesn't actually improve their areas, so it doesn't give them that reparation. It should give them reparation of freedom to decide what they want to do. But secondly, I think it actively generates resentment because even if economic development happens, it happens after people have gotten angry and elected a populist mayor that told them to screw the central government that's preventing you from sending your family remittances by going to the city. That means that ultimately it still gets worse on their side. CO.
Thank you, Emil, for the fine speech. Can we welcome Lovell? Here.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. So the last speaker's case essentially talks about how we fundamentally cannot build industries in rural areas because they need to be based around cities. She gives us a few reasons for these, and those are the things I'm going to focus on at the start of the speech. Firstly, why you the fact that these countries are on a supply chain, and you have to be specialized in a specific thing on a specific area of a supply chain in order to be successful. We tell you that this is firstly not true, but secondly, actively harmful to these countries. Why is this the case? Well, firstly, when you're on a supply chain, you are very often in the way that these specific areas and countries are, for example, being right next to a harbor, you're often on the first rung of that supply chain, which is to say that you are providing natural resources, raw materials at their very base. Reasons that this is often not very good. Firstly, these products have very high fluctuation rates in terms of things like profit. So you will never get huge amounts of investment into these areas because you can never guarantee future profits in the way you can for secondary and tertiary areas. That's why countries that provide like raw materials have continued to remain very poor in the last couple of decades, whilst more wealthy countries have seen their GDP and their profits skyrocket. It is in the active incentive of developed countries to lock these countries into their first space on the supply chain because they don't make huge amounts of profit, because these are the sort of areas that will never enable them to develop as much as they need to get these individuals in urban areas in poor living conditions up to a good quality of life. What we would far, far rather see is these countries being diversified, moving up the supply chain, trying to develop internal industries, trying to develop internal economies. We recognize that often this is not easy, but we would rather on principle have them at least try, so they have the ability to have a potential future where these cities which are currently incredibly overcrowded, which currently face like mass poverty, can at least have the potential of getting to an economic level where they can provide the individuals within them some amount of like good quality of living. But secondly, we tell you that it is true that they can move up. Why is this the case? Well, we're seeing a rapid change in what is being asked of different countries now in a way that we think these countries on the first level of the supply chain can actively get involved in. What is this? This is an increase in like the necessary need for things like technology, people in like call centers, for example. This is a uniquely different industry to the one we have seen in the past, in that you don't need to be right next to, say, a harbor to provide it, but also that people in like Mumbai, as long as you have a basic level of like the ability to speak English, you can still get involved in this relatively profitable industry. Well, why we believe that this motion therefore is so crucial now is there is actually the ability for you to develop industries in technology which aren't like going to be the most innovative industries developing the next supply chain, but can enable you to be part of the global economy and enable you to develop profits without locking yourself into providing raw materials for very low prices at the behest of the powerful in the West. The second thing that they tell us is that like there will never be enough people in these in the employees in these areas for them to have power. And they give the example of it, like pollution, for example. Know that under the status quo, that's simply not true, right? There are huge numbers of people in Mumbai, yet the pollution levels of Mumbai are still very, very high, right? These people who employ these individuals in these industries are not employers who give like care whatsoever about these employees, because they have no incentive to. They're often imported from the West. They often employ large numbers of people in these countries without actually caring, pay them incredibly low wages at incredibly low rates. By creating more industries in rural areas, even if they are smaller industries, you're far more likely to get employers who care about their employees, because A, there are simply less of them, so you have more of an ability to track them, but B, you're more invested in your local community, you're more likely to be from the area or to live in the area, you're more likely to care. That's when you truly get employees protected. That's when you truly get the people who are most vulnerable cared about by those who employ them. Then now in order to provide some comparative with the material we talked about, because we talked to you uniquely about immigrants within the society, how these immigrants who don't have support networks or savings, who are the most vulnerable people in this debate, and who under the status quo, the state does not help, and indeed is actively incentivized to work against them, not just economically, but socially and politically. These are the individuals we integrate into communities. These are the individuals we provide support to and jobs to and networks to. And even in opposition's best case, these individuals have to accept slightly lower paychecks because they are living in areas that are far less crowded or have far lower prices, because they're living in areas where their employers actually care about them, where they can actually develop a community, because they're not living in places that are full of pollution and full of other people in incredibly poor locations. And because we've not had any substantial rebuttal on these individuals yet, we think on that alone we win this debate. But then now let's go back to what opening opposition told you on this, because they told you that these people, they told you that this is like these people will always be there, and therefore we need the investment. And indeed, this is something that closing also talks about. Before I go on, I'll take your POI.
We've talked about how the identities of like people are not centered around a single city, and often people move between cities. Can you give any line of like addressing why then social and economical and political capital needs to be divided between the two cities?
Okay, so the sort of people who move between cities are these sort of people who can afford to move between cities, right? It is just not true that like those who are living in like camps in Rio are going to move to different cities later on, right? It's often incredibly difficult to even establish yourself in these places in the first place, in these favelas. To then move to a favela, you know, hundreds of thousands of miles away is just going to be impossible. That one move is hard enough. The people who move around cities are the sort of people who accept jobs in different cities, who could probably accept jobs in the countryside, who could probably move to different countries if you want to. We really don't care about these individuals within this debate, and they're not the individuals who are harmed most by the concentration of these resources, because it's simply not true that if the government decides to like invest in an entirely another city to the one that you have just moved your entire family to, that you've just built your home in a favela in, that you can then pack them all up again and move again. These are incredibly tiring and taxing moves. I'm going to stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Lovell, for the fine speech. Can we welcome Upward? Here.
Can someone please confirm that I'm audible?
Yep.
Wonderful. Largely three clashes in this debate. First, I'm going to look at the incentives that people have to move to cities and how or whether they change under this policy. Second, I will look at where the disenfranchised are better off. Spoiler alert on op. And also lastly, I will talk extensively about the political landscape. But first, let's look at the incentives to move, because I asked OG a POI on why do people have the incentives to move in the status quo? And they explain, they respond by talking about already existing investments, already existing infrastructure for education and for health and for other services that are of use and very desirable for individuals, and that highly contribute to a higher quality of life. I am unsure how any of that changes, because like lucky for me, Kat has already done the meta debating rant, so I don't have to. I will just point out that this debate isn't about whether magically at the end of a very, very long timeline where all of the capital and all of the political power in the country have been equally distributed across regions, how does it look like? We are looking at how this emotion might actually lead us there. And the problem is that government is very concerned with giving you all the benefits of how great it would be if you would be able to equally distribute capital across regions, but I have no idea how we actually get there. So let's look at how this actual motion leads to changes in the status quo. Kat gives you systemic analysis on why hubs are always going to gear towards cities, and even if we might buy from government that, you know, what's going to happen is that now all of the investment is going to go somewhere else, what happens is that these same systemic analysis is going to mean that even if you now don't go to an already existing big city, you will just create a new big city that then drains the rest of the country in a new place. You might have changed the fact that now the old city isn't the one doing it, but you haven't changed the actual problems that come with it, right? And notice that the analysis Kat gives you goes way beyond a country not being able to afford to build 50 New Yorks, which is basically what OO is giving you, right? So what that means is that even with OG's model, leading to the best outcome that they want, they either get a new big city that has the same problems as the old big city, or what's more likely to happen, as Kat tells you, is that the majority of companies will remain where they are because higher taxes on their revenue is still preferable to crippling their business by giving up on competitive advantages and thus paying lower taxes, but of much lower revenue, which means that at best, OG's model does nothing, and at worst, it creates a lot of new harms. And also looking at closing government's idea on why which is also derivative of OG, because OG also wants to diversify the rest of the country, right? The problem is that I'm unsure how that happens under the model, because what they want is to disperse capital and expertise and labor across many, many different hubs, and somehow expect those many different hubs to each develop to being a full large-scale hub that is able to provide everyone with jobs and the infrastructure that they need. And I have no idea how that is likely to happen. That only works in big cities, which OG is so opposed to. What that also means is that more investment that is now coming into the country, even with this new taxing model, is probably still going to the cities where there already are resources and labor concentrated, where it's a slow investment to slowly move to the next level of production that then gives people access to better jobs that CG wants. That also happens on side opposition. It's unclear why, I have no mecs that come from CG on why employees would get better labor regulations and better protections under their side of the house, right? So let's look at where the disenfranchised are better off. We think that they are much better off when they have at least the opportunity to move to the cities, because they want to be closer to education, they want to be closer to jobs. And yes, I understand that living in slums in a city, in order for you to be able to go to university, and commuting half an hour to university and commuting half an hour to a hospital is still not ideal. However, is significantly better than what you have in a status quo in rural areas where you aren't able to access these things in the first place. That is why we see a lot of people actively choosing to opt into living in slums and poor living conditions, because the benefits they get are valued by them higher than the poor living conditions, right? And what government is doing isn't showing any meaningful reduction of the people in rural areas who don't have toilets, right? The only thing they're doing is they're making it even harder for people to choose to move to the cities, to choose to live in poor conditions, but at least have access to a lot of things that will then allow them intergenerational upwards mobility, right? So Kat explains to you why it's problematic for the government to restrict this freedom of choice in this way. And we have no response coming from government on why that would be a legitimate thing to do. It is a massive infringement that we shouldn't allow. But also, secondly, I think that leads to even more disillusioned people, because the reality of most best conditions being in the city aren't going to change, because notice the rich still remain in the cities, even though they pay higher taxes. And now not only do you see the rich in the cities having a better life than you, but now you also know that because of government policy actively preventing you from moving there, you are thus also shut out from it. I think that leads to a lot worse outcomes on every point that OG cares about. But also looking at why industries work better in the cities, like again, Kat's analysis on this is unresponded to, right? But also, if you have to engage in global competitions, it's still better if the jobs are at least in your country and in your language, right? OG's concern of land space being clogged is actually what helps upwards mobility, because cities keep expanding, right? And the borders of the cities keep expanding. So that means that the people who lived in slums a generation ago now live in highly desirable areas where their property has has appreciated highly in value, and it allows intergenerational upper mobility, right? Sure, it doesn't happen overnight, but neither does developing whole new regions and trying to make them competitive. I will take a POI from opening.
Your argument is self-defeating, because if cities have to expand, why can't they expand the development to the rural area, since we said there's a space saturation problem that exists in these spaces, leading to lower quality.
The reason why they expand is because it is much easier to expand in the proximity where the infrastructure that you've built, where the companies that you have can serve something that's half an hour further away from them. It's much harder for that to happen when what you serve is 6 hours away from you, right? That is no longer a quick commute that you can do. That is something that you are locked out of, because no one can commute 6 hours to their jobs. No suppliers that have to deliver daily raw material are going to be able to do that if they're 6 hours away from you, or 12 hours away from you, or I don't know how long it takes for you to cross from one industrial hub to another in India or in China, right? But let's look at the political landscape, because what happens is the majority of state budget comes from cities, right? The reason why a minority has a majority of political power is money. That remains unchanged. What does happen, however, is that now there's lower tax paid by the countryside and higher tax in the cities, which means that you even increase the imbalance of power, which means that you increase the leverage that the elites have over politicians. You increase the damage they can do to the people in power if they threaten to fund their opponent, or if they're threatening to take their money elsewhere, which means that you don't make the government more likely to want to invest in minority areas. Minority areas being separated geographically will still compete with each other. However, you give even more power to the rich, because now they make up an even higher percentage of the state budget, and you actually disenfranchise minorities and poor people even more. There is no benefit coming out from this policy, but you make everyone's lives worse off for no good reason. Please oppose.
Thank you, Upward, for the fine speech. Thank you, everyone, for the fantastic